In the sweltering summer of 1871, the city of Savannah, Georgia, was a place caught between two worlds, suspended in the amber of its own complicated history, still bearing the wounds of a war that had ended only 6 years prior, still rebuilding, still remembering, still haunted by ghosts, both literal and figurative, that seemed to walk its cobblestone streets when the Spanish moss hung heavy and the evening fog rolled in from the river. This was a city of secrets, a city where the past never truly died, but merely retreated into the shadows of the grand antebellum mansions that lined the squares, where whispered conversations behind closed doors could destroy reputations or resurrect them, where the living and the dead maintained a relationship far more intimate than most northern visitors could ever comprehend. And it was here, in this peculiar corner of the American South, in this city that seemed to exist outside of time itself, that one of the most disturbing and inexplicable mysteries of the 19th century would unfold, a mystery that would confound investigators, terrify the local population, and leave questions that remain unanswered to this very day. This is the story of the Holloway sisters, Adelaide and Marguerite, two women who lived in a crumbling mansion on the outskirts of Forsyth Park, two women who had resided in Savannah for as long as anyone could remember, and two women who, according to every witness who ever encountered them, never seemed to age a single day. The Holloway mansion stood at the end of a narrow lane that branched off from Whitaker Street, a three-story structure of weathered brick and wrought iron that had clearly seen better days, but still maintained an air of faded grandeur that spoke to wealth long since depleted but never entirely forgotten. The house had been built sometime in the 1820s by a cotton merchant named Cornelius Whitfield, a man who had made his fortune in the early days of the cotton boom and had spared no expense in constructing what was, at the time, one of the most impressive private residences in all of Savannah. The house featured elaborate ironwork balconies imported from New Orleans, hand-painted ceiling medallions crafted by Italian artisans brought over specifically for the project, and a garden that had once been considered the finest in the city, filled with exotic plants and flowers that Whitfield had collected during his travels throughout Europe and South America. But Cornelius Whitfield had died under mysterious circumstances in 1842, reportedly falling from the very balcony he had so prized, and the house had passed through several owners before finally coming into the possession of the Holloway family sometime in the late 1840s, though the exact date of this transaction has never been conclusively established, as the relevant records were destroyed in a fire at the county courthouse in 1853. The Holloway sisters themselves were even more of an enigma than the house they inhabited. Adelaide was the elder of the two, or at least she claimed to be, a tall woman with hair so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and eyes of an unusual amber color that many who met her found deeply unsettling. She spoke with an accent that no one could quite place, sometimes sounding vaguely French, other times carrying hints of something older, something that seemed to belong to no particular country or era. Marguerite was shorter and fairer, with skin so pale it was almost translucent, and a manner so quiet and reserved that many assumed she was mute until she spoke, which she rarely did, and when she did speak, her voice was described as sounding like wind chimes, delicate and musical but somehow wrong, as if the words themselves were not being produced by human vocal cords at all. Together, the two sisters formed a unit that seemed almost impenetrable, moving through the world as if they existed in a bubble of their own making, observing the citizens of Savannah with expressions that suggested they found the whole spectacle of human life mildly amusing, but ultimately inconsequential. The first documented mention of the Holloway sisters in Savannah society appeared in a letter written by a woman named Elizabeth Parsons to her cousin in Charleston, dated March of 1849. In this letter, Elizabeth described attending a small gathering at the home of Dr. James Worthington, a prominent physician who had recently returned from studying in Europe and who was known for hosting intimate salons where the intellectual elite of Savannah could discuss philosophy, literature, and the emerging sciences of the day. Elizabeth wrote that the gathering had been pleasant enough until the arrival of two women who were introduced only as the Holloway sisters, recently arrived from somewhere in the northeastern states. She described them as beautiful but strange, noting that Adelaide had dominated every conversation she entered with a knowledge of history and literature that seemed almost supernaturally comprehensive, while Marguerite had sat in a corner observing everyone with those pale, unblinking eyes of hers, never speaking a word, but somehow making everyone in the room uncomfortable simply by existing. Elizabeth concluded her description by noting that both women appeared to be in their late 20s or early 30s, and that she hoped she would never encounter them again, though she could not articulate exactly why they had disturbed her so greatly. What makes this letter particularly significant is that it provides us with a baseline, a starting point from which we can track the Holloway sisters through the subsequent decades and observe the phenomenon that would eventually lead to their infamy. In 1849, according to Elizabeth Parsons, the sisters appeared to be in their late 20s or early 30s. But the same description would be applied to them in 1855, when the local newspaper mentioned them in passing in a society column covering a charity event for the new orphanage. And again in 1861, when war came to the South, and the sisters were noted as having made a substantial donation to the Confederate cause, with the reporter describing them as two handsome women of indeterminate but clearly youthful age. And yet again in 1868, when a visiting journalist from New York wrote a series of articles about life in the reconstructed South and made special mention of the eccentric Holloway sisters, who, he noted, seemed remarkably well preserved for women who had reportedly lived in the city for nearly 2 decades. By 1871, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The Holloway sisters had been residing in Savannah for over 20 years, possibly longer, and yet they looked exactly the same as they had when they first arrived. Not similar, not well preserved, but identical. The same faces, the same figures, the same manner of walking and speaking and carrying themselves through the world. They did not age. They did not change. They existed in a state of perfect stasis, while everyone around them withered and declined and eventually died. And by the summer of 1871, the citizens of Savannah had begun to talk, first in whispers, then in increasingly urgent conversations that spread through the drawing rooms and parlors of the city like wildfire. The primary chronicler of the events that would unfold that summer was a man named Thomas Brennan, an Irish immigrant who had come to Savannah in 1863 as a war correspondent for a northern newspaper, and had stayed after falling in love with both the city and a local woman named Sarah, whom he married in 1866. Brennan was a trained journalist with a skeptical mind and a talent for investigation, and when rumors about the Holloway sisters began to reach fever pitch in the spring of 1871, he decided to look into the matter himself, partly out of professional curiosity, and partly because he thought he might be able to write a human interest story that would dispel the increasingly hysterical speculation and restore some measure of calm to the community. What he discovered instead was a rabbit hole that would consume the next several months of his life and leave him a changed man, a man who, according to his wife's later testimony, never slept soundly again for the rest of his days. Brennan began his investigation by attempting to trace the Holloway sisters' history back to its source. Where had they come from before arriving in Savannah? Who were their family members? What was the source of their apparently substantial wealth? These seemed like simple enough questions, the kind of basic biographical details that any competent journalist could uncover with a few days of research and some well-placed inquiries. But the more Brennan dug, the more frustrated he became, because every lead he followed seemed to dissolve into nothing. Every promising trail ended in a dead end, and every person who claimed to have information about the sisters' past seemed to be repeating second-hand stories that could never be verified. The sisters themselves claimed to have come from a small town in Massachusetts, but when Brennan wrote to the town hall of the place they named, he received a response indicating that no family by the name of Holloway had ever resided there. They claimed their father had been a shipping merchant who had left them a substantial inheritance, but no record of such a merchant could be found in any of the maritime records of the northeastern states. They claimed to have been educated at a private academy for young ladies in Philadelphia, but the academy in question had burned down in 1836, and all of its records had been destroyed. It was as if the Holloway sisters had simply materialized out of thin air sometime in the late 1840s, fully formed and possessed of enough wealth and social grace to establish themselves in Savannah society without anyone questioning their origins too closely. Even more disturbing were the stories Brennan began to uncover from long-time residents of Savannah who had known the sisters since their arrival. Margaret O'Brien, an elderly woman who had worked as a seamstress for many of the city's wealthier families, told Brennan that she had first met Adelaide Holloway in 1850, when Adelaide had commissioned a series of dresses for the winter social season. Margaret had been in her early 20s at the time, and Adelaide had appeared to be roughly the same age, perhaps a few years older. Now in 1871, Margaret was approaching 70, her hair had turned white, her face was lined with wrinkles, and her hands shook with the tremors of age. But Adelaide, according to Margaret, looked exactly the same as she had 21 years ago. The same smooth skin, the same lustrous black hair without a strand of gray, the same lithe figure that had not gained or lost a single pound. Margaret crossed herself when she spoke of this and told Brennan that she had not accepted any further commissions from the Holloway household after noticing this disturbing fact, nor did she ever intend to. Similar accounts came from all quarters of the city. A former butler who had briefly worked in the Holloway mansion in 1854 testified that the sisters had looked the same then as they did now, and that he had quit his position after only 3 weeks because of what he described as the unnatural atmosphere of the house. A priest who had visited the mansion to solicit donations for his parish in 1859 recalled that both sisters had struck him as being in their early 30s, and that neither had shown any interest in attending services or receiving spiritual guidance. A doctor who had been called to the house in 1863, when Marguerite had reportedly fallen ill, stated that he had examined the younger sister and found her vital signs to be unusual. Her heartbeat much slower than normal and her body temperature several degrees below what would be expected in a healthy human being, and that when he had returned to check on her the following day, she had made a complete recovery that he could not explain. But it was the testimony of a man named Samuel Whittaker that truly set Brennan on edge and convinced him that whatever was happening at the Holloway mansion went far beyond simple eccentricity or fortunate genetics. Samuel Whittaker was 93 years old in 1871, one of the oldest men in Savannah, and his memory, though occasionally hazy on recent events, remained sharp as a tack when it came to the distant past. Samuel told Brennan that he had first seen Adelaide Holloway in 1819, more than 50 years ago, when he had been a young man of 20 working on the docks of the Savannah River. He remembered her clearly because she had been standing at the end of the pier, watching the ships come in, and he had thought her the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She had been wearing a green dress, he said, and her hair had been black as midnight, and when she had turned to look at him, her amber eyes had seemed to glow in the afternoon light. He had never forgotten that moment, that face, those eyes. And when the Holloway sisters had arrived in Savannah some 30 years later, he had recognized Adelaide immediately. She was the same woman, not her daughter, not her granddaughter, but the very same woman he had seen standing on that pier in 1819. She had not aged a single day in 3 decades. He was certain of it. He would stake his immortal soul on it. When Brennan pressed Samuel on this point, asking if perhaps he might be mistaken, if perhaps the woman he had seen in 1819 had simply been a relative of Adelaide's who bore a strong family resemblance, the old man had grown agitated. He knew what he saw, he insisted. He had looked into those amber eyes twice in his life, once as a young man and once as an old one, and they were the same eyes, containing the same strange depth, the same ancient knowing, the same subtle amusement at the spectacle of human mortality. The Holloway sisters were not natural, Samuel said. They were not of this world, and whatever they were, whatever force sustained them while others grew old and died, it was not something that came from God. Armed with these testimonies and dozens more like them, Brennan decided to approach the Holloway mansion directly and request an interview with the sisters themselves. He sent a formal letter to their address, explaining that he was writing an article about longtime residents of Savannah and would be honored if they would consent to share their memories of the city's history. He did not expect a response, but to his surprise, he received one within 3 days, a brief note written in elegant copperplate hand inviting him to call at the mansion the following Friday evening at 8 o'clock. The note was signed simply A. Holloway and bore no further commentary. The evening of the interview was humid and oppressively hot, as Savannah evenings tended to be in the summer months, and Brennan later wrote that he felt a sense of foreboding from the moment he turned onto the narrow lane that led to the Holloway mansion. The house loomed at the end of the lane like something out of a Gothic novel, its windows dark except for a faint glow on the second floor that suggested candlelight rather than the newer gas lamps that had become fashionable in the wealthier homes of the city. The garden that had once been the pride of the original owner had become an overgrown jungle of vegetation, with vines climbing the wrought iron fences and ancient oak trees forming a canopy so dense that very little moonlight penetrated to the ground below. The air smelled of jasmine and something else, something underneath the floral sweetness that Brennan could not identify, but which made his stomach turn. He was greeted at the door by an elderly black man who introduced himself as Moses, and who led him through a foyer decorated with paintings and tapestries that looked centuries old into a parlor where both sisters were waiting. Adelaide sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, despite the heat, and Marguerite stood by the window, looking out at the garden with an expression of serene detachment. Both women were dressed in black, as if in mourning, though Brennan could not imagine who they might be mourning for. They looked exactly as every witness had described them, young, beautiful, and utterly wrong in some way that defied articulation. Adelaide's amber eyes fixed on Brennan as he entered the room, and he later wrote that he felt, in that moment, like a mouse that had wandered into a cat's den and was only permitted to remain alive at the cat's pleasure. The interview that followed was, by Brennan's own account, the strangest conversation of his life. Adelaide did most of the talking, answering his questions with what seemed like genuine amusement, as if she found his attempts at investigation charmingly naive. She confirmed that she and her sister had been living in Savannah since 1848, which was earlier than most records suggested, but still not early enough to account for Samuel Whittaker's testimony about seeing her in 1819. When Brennan brought up this discrepancy, Adelaide had simply smiled and said that old men often confused their memories of youth with their dreams, and that she was certain Mr. Whittaker meant well but was simply mistaken. She offered no explanation for why she and her sister had not visibly aged in over 2 decades, nor did she seem particularly concerned that this question had been asked. When Brennan pressed her on the matter, pointing out that numerous witnesses had testified to this phenomenon, she merely laughed, a sound that Brennan described as musical but also somehow wrong, like a chord played on an instrument that was missing a crucial string. Marguerite spoke only once during the entire interview. When Brennan asked directly what the secret of their apparent youth was, she turned from the window and looked at him with those pale, unblinking eyes, and she said, in that wind-chime voice that so many had found disturbing, that some secrets were too old for living men to understand, and that the price of understanding them was often more than any living man would willingly pay. Then she returned her gaze to the window and did not speak again for the remainder of the evening. Brennan left the Holloway mansion that night with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that something deeply wrong was happening behind those ivy-covered walls. He threw himself into his investigation with renewed vigor, spending days in the county archives searching for any documents that might shed light on the sisters' true origins, interviewing every person he could find who had ever had dealings with the Holloway household, and even writing to historians and academics in other cities to ask if they had ever encountered similar cases of apparent agelessness. The responses he received were, for the most part, dismissive, suggesting that he was either exaggerating the phenomenon or being deceived by clever makeup and theatrical tricks. But Brennan knew what he had seen with his own eyes, what he had felt in that parlor when Adelaide had looked at him, and he was not willing to accept mundane explanations for what was clearly not a mundane situation. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived from an unexpected source. In July of 1871, Brennan received a letter from a man named Dr. Harold Westbrook, a physician and amateur historian who lived in Boston and who claimed to have information relevant to Brennan's inquiry. Dr. Westbrook explained that he had spent many years researching unusual cases of longevity and had compiled a file of accounts dating back centuries that described individuals who appeared not to age as normal humans did. These accounts came from various sources: medieval church records, colonial-era diaries, newspaper clippings from the early 19th century. And in several of these accounts, Dr. Westbrook had noticed a recurring detail that he found deeply troubling. The individuals in question were almost always described as having unusual eyes, either amber or pale, and they were almost always described as being female, often appearing as sisters or mothers and daughters, and they were almost always connected to places where unusual deaths had occurred. Deaths that were often attributed to illness or accident, but which, upon closer examination, bore certain peculiar characteristics. Dr. Westbrook enclosed with his letter copies of several of these accounts. One, dated 1745, described a pair of sisters living in a small town in Virginia who were rumored to be witches, because they had not aged in the 20 years since their arrival. The account noted that several young men from the town had disappeared during that period and had never been found. Another, dated 1802, described a woman in Philadelphia who had been arrested on suspicion of murder after 3 of her servants had been found dead in her home, drained of blood. The woman had reportedly been in her 30s, but claimed to be over 70 years old. She had escaped from custody before trial and had never been seen again. A third account, dated 1831, described 2 women in New Orleans who matched the description of the Holloway sisters almost exactly, down to the amber eyes of the elder and the pale complexion of the younger. These women had fled the city after a servant had accused them of participating in unnatural rituals involving human blood. The implications of these accounts were clear, though Brennan was reluctant to accept them. The Holloway sisters were not merely women who had aged well or who possessed some unusual genetic quirk that preserved their youth. They were something else entirely, something that had existed for far longer than any human lifespan, something that had moved from place to place throughout the country, always adopting new identities, always establishing themselves in communities where they could live in comfort and secrecy, always eventually moving on when their failure to age became impossible to hide. And the accounts that Dr. Westbrook had collected suggested that wherever these women went, death followed, deaths that were often unexplained, deaths that involved the loss of blood, deaths that were attributed to natural causes, but which always clustered around the residences of these mysterious, ageless women. Brennan now faced a dilemma. He had accumulated enough evidence to write an article that would expose the Holloway sisters as something other than human, something dangerous, something that had likely been preying on the citizens of Savannah for over 2 decades. But who would believe him? The rational, scientific minds of the age would dismiss his claims as superstitious nonsense. The religious authorities would likely accuse him of sensationalism at best and heresy at worst. And the Holloway sisters themselves, if they truly were what the evidence suggested, might take action to silence him before he could publish anything at all. While Brennan wrestled with these questions, events in Savannah took a turn that forced his hand. On August 15, 1871, a young woman named Clara Jennings disappeared from her home in the middle of the night. Clara was 18 years old, the daughter of a prosperous merchant, and had no known reason to run away or to come to any harm. A search was organized, but no trace of her could be found. Then 3 days later, another young woman disappeared, this one a servant girl named Patience who worked in one of the homes near the waterfront. And 3 days after that, a third disappearance, a seamstress named Mary Sullivan who had last been seen walking home from her shop on Broughton Street. In the space of 9 days, 3 young women had vanished without a trace, and the city of Savannah was gripped by a fear that bordered on hysteria. Brennan immediately suspected the Holloway sisters, though he had no direct evidence connecting them to the disappearances. He began watching the mansion from a discreet distance, noting the comings and goings of the household and looking for any sign of unusual activity. What he observed was troubling. The sisters rarely left the house during the day, but at night, particularly on nights when the moon was new and the darkness was most complete, he occasionally saw figures moving in the garden, figures that seemed to glide rather than walk, and that occasionally appeared to be carrying burdens that were roughly the size and shape of human bodies. On the night of August 28th, Brennan made a decision that he would later describe as either the bravest or the most foolish of his life. He waited until well after midnight, then climbed over the wrought iron fence that surrounded the Holloway property and made his way through the overgrown garden toward the house. His intention was to find evidence, something concrete that he could take to the authorities, something that would force them to investigate the sisters and perhaps rescue whatever victims might still be alive inside those walls. What he found instead was something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The back door of the mansion was unlocked, which Brennan found suspicious, but which he chose to interpret as a stroke of luck rather than a trap. He entered through the kitchen and made his way through the dark corridors of the house, guided by nothing but the faint moonlight that filtered through the dusty windows and his own sense of direction. The house was silent, oppressively so, and the air was thick with a smell that Brennan later described as being like copper and roses, a sweet, metallic odor that made his eyes water and his throat constrict. He moved carefully, testing each floorboard before putting his full weight on it, terrified that any noise might alert the sisters to his presence. He found the basement door at the end of a narrow hallway on the first floor. It was heavier than the other doors in the house, reinforced with iron bands, and it was secured with a lock that would have been impossible for him to pick if it had been engaged. But the lock was open, hanging loose from its hasp as if someone had recently passed through and had not bothered to secure it behind them. Brennan hesitated for a long moment, every instinct he possessed screaming at him to turn around and leave this place while he still could. But the thought of Clara Jennings and the other missing women drove him forward, and he pulled the door open and descended the stairs into the darkness below. What he saw in the basement of the Holloway mansion was something that no subsequent investigation was ever able to fully confirm or explain, because by the time the authorities arrived at the house 3 days later, the basement had been completely cleared of its contents, leaving behind only bare stone walls and an empty space that smelled faintly of chemicals and something else. Something underneath that Brennan recognized immediately as the same copper and roses odor he had encountered upstairs. But in that moment, in the darkness illuminated only by the single candle he had brought with him, Brennan saw what he could only describe as an abattoir, a place designed for the systematic processing of human bodies. There were tables along the walls, long wooden surfaces stained dark with what could only be blood. There were instruments, gleaming steel and silver tools whose purposes Brennan could not immediately identify, but which clearly involved cutting and draining and preserving. There were jars on shelves, dozens of them, filled with dark liquid that reflected the candlelight with an oily sheen. And there were bodies, or what remained of bodies, hanging from hooks on the far wall, pale and still and drained of everything that had once made them alive. Brennan counted 5 of them before his nerve broke, and he fled, stumbling up the stairs and through the house and out into the garden, where he collapsed onto his hands and knees and vomited until there was nothing left in his stomach. He ran. He did not stop running until he reached the police station on Drayton Street, where he burst through the doors and demanded to speak with whoever was in charge. The story he told was fragmented, hysterical, difficult to believe. The officer on duty initially suspected that Brennan was drunk or mentally disturbed, but something in his eyes, something in the raw terror that suffused his every word, convinced the officer that this was worth taking seriously. A group of officers was assembled, and they accompanied Brennan back to the Holloway mansion as dawn was breaking over the city. What they found was an empty house. The basement had been cleared as previously mentioned, leaving no trace of the horrors Brennan had described. The parlor where he had been interviewed was empty of furniture. The bedrooms were stripped bare. The garden, which had been overgrown but still alive when Brennan had visited weeks earlier, was now a wasteland of dead plants and withered vines, as if something had drained the life from every growing thing on the property. The Holloway sisters were gone. Moses, their servant, was gone. Every trace of their residence in the house had been systematically removed, leaving behind only the structure itself and the lingering smell of something sweet and metallic that the officers could not identify. A search of the property turned up only one piece of physical evidence, a single earring discovered in the garden near the back gate that was later identified as belonging to Clara Jennings, the first of the young women to disappear. This was enough to confirm that the sisters had been involved in the disappearances, but it was not enough to explain what had happened to the victims or to reveal where the sisters had fled. The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately fruitless. The Holloway sisters had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only questions and the lingering terror of those who had encountered them. Thomas Brennan wrote his article, a long and detailed account of his investigation that was published in a national magazine in the fall of 1871. The article was controversial, with many readers dismissing it as sensationalist fiction, while others took it as confirmation of their darkest fears about what might lurk in the shadows of the supposedly civilized world. Brennan himself never recovered from his experience in the Holloway basement. According to his wife, Sarah, he suffered from nightmares for the rest of his life, waking in the small hours of the morning screaming about amber eyes and rooms that smelled of copper and roses. He died in 1887 at the age of 54, officially of heart failure, though Sarah always maintained that what killed him was something that had broken inside him on that August night in 1871, something that had never healed. The Holloway mansion stood empty for many years, avoided by the citizens of Savannah, who whispered that it was cursed, that the spirits of the murdered women walked its corridors at night, that strange lights could sometimes be seen in the windows and strange sounds could sometimes be heard from the garden. In 1893, The house was purchased by a development company that intended to tear it down and build a row of modern townhouses on the lot. But on the night before demolition was scheduled to begin, the mansion caught fire, a blaze so intense that it reduced the structure to ashes in a matter of hours. The cause of the fire was never determined, though there were whispers that it had been set deliberately, either by someone seeking to destroy what remained of the Holloway sisters' legacy or by something else, something that did not want its secrets exposed to the light of day. And so the mystery of the Holloway sisters remained unsolved, one of the many dark chapters in the history of Savannah that locals prefer not to discuss, but which they never quite managed to forget. Who were Adelaide and Marguerite Holloway? What were they? How long had they lived, and how many other communities had they haunted before arriving in Savannah? How many victims had fallen prey to whatever practices they conducted in that basement, and what was the purpose of those practices? Were they truly immortal, sustained by the blood of the young and the innocent? Or were they something else entirely, something that defies the categories we use to make sense of the world? There are those who believe that the Holloway sisters are still out there, somewhere, having adopted new names and new identities, and established themselves in some other unsuspecting community where they can continue their ancient work undetected. There are those who claim to have seen women matching their descriptions in cities throughout the South and the Northeast, always in pairs, always appearing to be in their late 20s or early 30s, always with those distinctive eyes, amber and pale, that seem to look through you rather than at you. There are even those who claim that the sisters have been documented in photographs spanning more than a century, their faces unchanged, while the fashions and settings around them evolve through the decades. But these are just stories, whispered in the dark places where people gather to share their fears, passed down from generation to generation like heirlooms of dread. The truth of the Holloway sisters, whatever it might be, lies buried in the past, in the ashes of a burned mansion and the faded pages of a journalist's account, and the nightmares of those who were unfortunate enough to encounter them in life. All we know for certain is that they existed, that they did not age, that young women disappeared, and that when the light was finally shone upon their activities, they vanished into the darkness from which they had come, leaving behind only questions that may never be answered. The city of Savannah has changed much since 1871, growing and modernizing while still retaining the essential character that makes it unique among American cities. The lot where the Holloway mansion once stood is now a small park, a quiet green space where children play and elderly people sit on benches reading newspapers in the afternoon sun. There is no plaque commemorating what once stood there, no marker indicating the horrors that may have occurred on that ground. The city has chosen to forget, or at least to pretend to forget, and perhaps that is for the best. Some stories are too dark to be remembered, too disturbing to be integrated into the cheerful narrative of civic progress and community spirit that cities like to tell about themselves. And yet the story persists, passed from one teller to another, growing and changing with each retelling, but always retaining its essential core of mystery and horror. The Holloway sisters, who never seemed to age, who lived among the citizens of Savannah for decades without anyone questioning their nature, who may have been responsible for the deaths of countless young women over the course of their long, long lives. They are gone now, or at least they are gone from Savannah, but the fear they inspired remains, a shadow that falls across the bright squares and elegant architecture of the city, a reminder that not everything that walks among us is what it appears to be, and that some secrets are indeed too old for living men to understand. The final entry in Thomas Brennan's journal, written just weeks before his death, contains a single question that he never answered and that perhaps no one will ever be able to answer. He wrote, "I have spent 16 years trying to understand what I saw in that basement, what Adelaide meant when she smiled at me in that parlor, what Marguerite meant when she spoke of secrets too old for living men. I have read every account of such beings that I could find, from the ancient myths of blood-drinking demons to the more recent tales of vampires and revenants that have become popular in European literature. And I have come to believe that the truth is simpler and more terrible than any of these legends suggest. The Holloway sisters were not supernatural beings in the traditional sense. They were simply very, very old, old enough to have learned things that we cannot imagine, old enough to have developed methods of preserving their youth that we cannot comprehend, old enough to have lost whatever human conscience they might once have possessed. They were what we might become if we lived long enough, freed from the constraints of mortality that keep us human. And that, more than anything else, is what terrifies me. Not the blood, not the bodies, not even the amber eyes that I see every time I close my own, but the possibility that they are not monsters at all, that they are simply us, given enough time. What happened to the Holloway sisters after they fled Savannah remains unknown. Perhaps they are still out there somewhere, wearing new faces and new names, watching and waiting, and continuing whatever ancient work brought them to that crumbling mansion on the outskirts of Forsyth Park so many years ago. Perhaps they have finally died, succumbing at last to whatever mortality they had so long evaded, their bodies crumbling to dust in some forgotten corner of the world. Or perhaps they are something else entirely, something beyond our understanding, something that will continue to exist long after everyone who ever knew them has turned to bones and memory. We will probably never know, and perhaps in the end, it is better that way. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, their darkness preserved intact as a warning to those who might be tempted to dig too deep into the shadows of the past. The Holloway sisters, Adelaide and Marguerite, who never seem to age, have taken their secrets with them into whatever darkness they now inhabit. And the city of Savannah sleeps on, dreaming its dreams of moss and magnolia, trying not to remember what once walked its streets in the dead of night, what may still be walking somewhere, what may never truly die.